Hey there. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to think about money, but not in any stressful way. We're just going to look at it very slowly, very gently, and start peeling back the layers of what it actually is. Because money is one of those things that feels completely solid and real when you have it in your hands. But the more you look at it, the more you realize how many invisible agreements are holding it all together. We're going to start from the world as it is right now, and we're going to walk slowly backwards, undoing one layer at a time, until we arrive somewhere very quiet and very simple. So get comfortable. There's no rush. This is going to be a long, slow, easy journey, and you can let your mind drift as much as it wants to along the way. Right now, at this very moment, somewhere in the world, someone is tapping a phone against a card reader at a coffee shop. They don't hand anything over. Nothing changes hands. There's no coin, no paper, no object of any kind. There's just a small electronic signal that travels from one device to another, and in the time it takes to blink, a number stored on a server somewhere goes down by $4.50, and a different number stored on a different server somewhere else goes up by $4.50. And both parties walk away satisfied. The coffee shop has what it needs. The customer has their coffee. The whole transaction is complete. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, just noticing how strange it is when you really look at it. Nothing moved. No object passed from one person to another. What happened was entirely informational. Numbers shifted. Records were updated. And yet both people involved in that exchange felt, completely correctly, that something real had occurred. That a genuine transfer had taken place. That value had moved from one place to another. This is what money looks like right now, at the very edge of its current form. It's mostly a record-keeping system. It's a set of numbers that live in databases, maintained by banks and financial institutions, constantly being updated as people spend and earn and transfer and save. The physical stuff, the paper bills and metal coins, still exist, and some people use them every day. But the numbers in those databases dwarf the physical currency by an enormous amount. Most of the money in the world, by a very wide margin, is nothing but entries in a ledger. Ones and zeros on a hard drive somewhere. And that's fine. It works. The system functions smoothly most of the time because everyone involved agrees that the numbers mean something. Agrees to treat them as real, agrees to honor them. But if we want to understand what money really is, and why it works, and what would happen if one layer after another were slowly removed, we have to start moving backwards. We have to start undoing things. And we can do that very gently, one step at a time. If we step back a little further from that tap-to-pay transaction, we arrive at the moment before smartphones made everything wireless and invisible. Not that long ago, really. Maybe 15 or 20 years, depending on where you were in the world. At this point, people still had bank accounts and credit cards, and the whole invisible ledger system was fully in place. But the way you accessed that system was slightly more physical. You carried a card. A plastic rectangle with a magnetic stripe on the back, or later a small chip embedded in its face. And when you wanted to move money from your record to a merchant's record, You slid that card through a reader or inserted it into a slot, and the machine read the information encoded on it, contacted your bank's computers through a telephone line or a data network, and asked a simple question. Does this person have enough numbers in their account to cover this transaction? And if the answer came back yes, the numbers were moved. If no, the transaction was declined. The card itself wasn't money. This is something that's easy to overlook. The plastic card had no inherent value. It was just a key, a way of proving to the machine and to the network behind the machine that you were who you said you were, that you had access to a particular account, that you had authorization to move numbers around. The card was a kind of credential, a physical token that represented your identity in the system. And that system was built on top of something older, the bank itself, and the account it held, and the numbers sitting in that account. So if we step back a little further, we arrive at the bank account, the thing that the card was giving you access to. A bank account is, in its simplest form, a promise. When you deposit money into a bank, the bank doesn't put your specific money in a specific box and keep it there for you. The money goes into the bank's general pool of funds. What you receive in return is a promise from the bank that they owe you that amount. They will pay it back to you whenever you ask, in whatever form you need, whether that's cash from an ATM, or a transfer to another account, or a payment to a merchant. The number in your account is a record of how much the bank owes you. It's a debt the bank has taken on, with you as the creditor. This is one of those things that sounds slightly unsettling when you first hear it, but it's actually quite ordinary once you sit with it. Banks take in deposits from many thousands of customers and make promises to all of them. They use the pooled funds to make loans to borrowers, who pay interest, and that interest is how the bank earns money. The depositors get their money back on demand. The borrowers pay back their loans over time. And the whole thing works because not everyone asks for their money back at the same time. The bank is always juggling many different promises, but as long as most people leave their deposits alone most of the time, the juggling works fine. This practice of holding only a fraction of deposits in reserve while lending out the rest is called fractional reserve banking, and it's been the standard model for a very long time. So when you had a balance of, say, $800 in your account, what you really had was a promise from your bank that they would give you $800 worth of whatever you needed, whenever you asked. You weren't holding $800. You were holding a promise for $800. And that promise, that number, was what the card in your wallet was allowing you to move around. If we step back even further, we get to the question of what those numbers actually represented. Because for a long time, they represented something very specific. Something physical. A real object that was supposed to be sitting in a vault somewhere. For most of modern history, paper money was not money in the way we tend to think of it today. It was a receipt, a claim ticket, a piece of paper that said, in effect, the institution that issued this piece of paper is holding a certain amount of gold or silver, and the person who presents this paper can exchange it for that gold or silver on demand. The paper itself had no value. It was just a convenient way of carrying around the claim. It was easier to put a piece of paper in your pocket than to lug a bar of gold to the market. So people carried the paper and left the gold at the bank. This system, tying paper currency to a physical store of precious metal, is called a commodity-backed monetary system. The most famous version of it in modern history is the gold standard, where a currency's value was fixed to a specific quantity of gold. A dollar was defined as a certain weight of gold. If you brought your paper dollar to the bank, they were supposed to hand you that exact weight of gold in return. The paper was just a promise, and the promise was backed by the real thing sitting in a vault. And there's something very comforting about that, in a way. When money is backed by gold, the relationship is almost tangible. You can picture the gold. You know it exists somewhere. The numbers have a physical anchor. There's a weight to them, a presence, a thing you could theoretically put in your hand. But if we step back a little further, we have to ask a different question. Why was gold the thing the money was anchored to? What made gold the right choice? Why not copper or iron or wood or anything else? And when we ask that question, we begin to see that even the gold standard was built on an agreement. A very old and very widely shared agreement, but an agreement nonetheless. Gold was chosen, over thousands of years of human history, because it had a particular combination of properties that made it useful as money. It was rare enough that you couldn't just find it lying around, which meant it was hard to inflate. It was durable, meaning it didn't rust or decay or crumble over time. It was divisible, meaning you could cut it into smaller pieces and each piece was still gold, worth a proportional amount. It was portable, at least more portable than, say, a pile of grain or a herd of cattle. It was recognizable, with a distinctive color and weight that made it hard to counterfeit convincingly. And it was consistent, meaning a gram of gold from one part of the world was the same as a gram of gold from another part. These properties made it a very good candidate for the role of money. But the value of gold wasn't inherent. It wasn't written into the universe that this particular yellow metal should be treated as the basis of all exchange. The value of gold came from the fact that people, over many generations across many cultures, had agreed to value it, had agreed to treat it as the anchor point, had agreed that it was worth something. And this is the first really important thing to understand about money. It has always been, at every layer, fundamentally a social agreement. A shared fiction in the deepest and most useful sense of that phrase. Not a lie, nothing manipulative or dishonest about it, but a collectively maintained belief. A story that everyone in a society tells each other and acts on, and that therefore becomes real in all the ways that matter. If we step back even further, before the gold standard was formalized, before the central banking systems that enforced it were built, we find ourselves in a world where trade was more visibly based on that agreement. A world where the things used as money were more varied and more openly tied to what a particular community had decided to value. Different societies at different times have used many different things as money. Salt was used as money across wide regions for a very long time. The Roman word for salary comes from the word for salt, a reflection of the fact that soldiers were sometimes paid in it. Salt was valuable because it preserved food, which was essential for survival, and because it didn't occur equally everywhere, which meant that in many places you had to trade for it. It was rare enough to be worth tracking, and useful enough that everyone needed it. Cowrie shells were used as currency across enormous stretches of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. These small, smooth, beautifully shaped shells were durable and hard to fake in great numbers, and they were rare enough inland that they had real trade value. Wampum, carefully crafted beads made from specific types of shell, served as a form of money among many Native American peoples, and was also used in early colonial America, sometimes even in official transactions with European settlers. Cacao beans were used in Mesoamerica. Barley and other grains served as units of account in ancient Mesopotamia. Amber, obsidian, copper, bronze, and many other materials have served as money at various times and places. What all of these have in common is the same thing gold has. They were chosen because of a combination of practical properties and collective agreement. They worked as money because enough people in enough situations agreed to treat them as money. And when you understand that, you start to understand something important about what money is and what it isn't. Money is not a thing. Or rather, money isn't any particular thing. Money is a role, a function. The thing that fills the role can change, and has changed many times throughout history, and will no doubt change again. What stays constant is the role itself. Money is whatever a community agrees to use to represent value, to keep track of who owes what to whom, and to make exchange easier. If we step back even further, to a time before any of these standardized currencies existed, we arrive at a world of direct barter. A world where if you wanted something that someone else had, you traded something they wanted in return. The farmer with extra grain traded with the potter who had too many clay pots. The shepherd with extra wool traded with the blacksmith who had extra iron tools. Each exchange was direct, immediate, and depended entirely on a coincidence of wants. You had to find someone who had what you needed and who also needed what you had. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants, and it's the fundamental limitation of pure barter. Imagine you're a baker who wants a new pair of sandals. In a barter economy, you have to find a sandal maker who wants bread, not a sandal maker who wants pottery, or fish, or cloth. Specifically one who wants bread, and the quantity you're willing to give, right now when you happen to need the sandals. If that exact combination of needs doesn't align, no trade happens. You go without your sandals, or the sandal maker goes without their bread. This is not an efficient system for anything other than very simple, very localized trade. And as communities grew larger, and as people began to specialize more, trading their labor and their skills for things they didn't produce themselves, the limitations of pure barter became more and more of a problem. It got harder and harder to find the exact coincidence of wants you needed for any given exchange. And so, slowly, naturally, communities began to use particular goods as intermediaries. If everyone agreed that a certain number of cowrie shells was roughly equivalent to a certain amount of labor or a certain quantity of grain, then you could trade your bread for cowrie shells, carry those shells around, and later trade them for the sandals. The shells solved the double coincidence problem. They became a common medium that everything else could be measured against. They became, in other words, money. This process probably happened independently in many different places, over many different periods. It wasn't the result of any single person's invention or any government's decree. It was an emergent solution to a practical problem. Communities figured out, through trial and error over generations, that it was easier to agree on a common medium of exchange and use that medium as the basis for all trade. But if we step back even further, before this emergence of commodity money, before the slow development of any shared medium of exchange, we arrive at something that might actually be older than barter itself. Something that anthropologists and historians have studied carefully, and that changes the usual story we tell about how money came to be. The traditional story, the one you probably heard at some point in school, goes like this. First there was barter. Then barter was clunky and inefficient. So people invented money to make barter easier. It's a clean, logical story, but it turns out it's not quite accurate. Or at least, it's only part of the picture. What anthropologists and historians have found, when they look at actual evidence from the societies that supposedly lived by pure barter before money, is that these societies didn't primarily work through immediate, one-for-one exchange. They worked through something older, and in some ways more complex. They worked through credit and obligation, through systems of social debt. In small communities, people give and receive without keeping precise accounts. You help your neighbor build their house, and they help you with your harvest later. You share food when you have extra, because someday when you don't have enough, someone will share with you. These exchanges aren't tracked to the penny. They're not balanced in real time. They operate on trust and memory and relationship. On the understanding that the community will, over time, find its own equilibrium. This is not a system without accounting. The accounting is just social. It lives in memory and reputation and expectation rather than in written ledgers. You know who has been generous and who has been stingy. The community knows. A person who always takes and never gives eventually finds that no one wants to give to them anymore. The system has self-correcting mechanisms built into the social fabric. Money, in this view, isn't a replacement for barter. It's a formalization of credit. A way of making visible and portable the web of obligations that already existed in the community. A cow's shell or a piece of silver didn't replace the handshake and the trust. It represented it. It made it transferable to strangers, tradable across distances, usable between people who had no existing relationship and no shared history. If you wanted to trade with a merchant from a distant city, you couldn't rely on a network of mutual obligation to facilitate the exchange. You had no history with this person. They had no reason to trust you, and you had no reason to trust them. Money gave you something to offer that was already trusted, already recognized, already embedded in the shared agreement. The merchant knew that the coins you handed over would be accepted by others in turn, so they would accept them from you. So the story of money is in some ways the story of how the credit and obligation that already existed in small communities was abstracted, formalized, and extended outward to encompass strangers and distances that would otherwise have been beyond the reach of trust. At an earlier stage, let's stay with that word credit for a moment, because it's one of the most ancient and durable concepts in the history of money. The word itself comes from the Latin credere, which means to believe or to trust. Credit is, at its root, the act of trusting someone, of believing that they will do what they say they will do, of extending the present moment's exchange into the future, trusting that the future will honor it. Some of the oldest written records we have found from ancient Mesopotamia, from the civilization that flourished in what is now Iraq more than 4,000 years ago, are not stories or poetry or records of kings. They are accounting tablets. Small clay tablets inscribed with marks that record who owed what to whom. Debts of grain, debts of silver, debts of labor. These tablets are evidence that credit, formalized and recorded, was already deeply woven into economic life thousands of years before coins were invented. The Mesopotamians used grain and silver as units of account, but the actual exchanges they recorded weren't always immediate transfers of physical goods. They were often promises, records of debts to be paid later. The farmer borrowed seed grain from the temple storehouse in the spring, promising to repay with interest after the harvest. The merchant borrowed silver to fund a trading expedition, promising to repay when the expedition returned. These were credit relationships, maintained by written records that gave them a kind of official existence. The temples and palaces of ancient Mesopotamia functioned, in some ways, like early banks. They accumulated surplus, they lent it out, they tracked what was owed. The clay tablets were their ledgers. And the units they used, the specific weights of silver or the specific measures of grain, were the common language in which obligations were expressed. What's remarkable about this is how familiar it feels. The details are different. The medium is clay instead of magnetic stripe. The unit is barley instead of dollars. But the underlying structure is the same. Someone has something, someone else needs it. The first person extends credit to the second. The debt is recorded, and eventually the debt is repaid. The fundamentals of the credit relationship have barely changed in 4,000 years. If we step back even further, behind the formal record keeping, behind the clay tablets and the temple storehouses, we find something even more fundamental. The recognition that exchange itself requires a shared understanding, a shared language of value. Before you can record a debt in grain, both parties have to agree on how grain is measured, have to agree that the unit is meaningful, have to agree that the record is binding, have to agree to honor the promise when the time comes. All of this agreement is, in a sense, prior to money. It's the social infrastructure that money is built on top of. Without shared weights and measures, without a common understanding of what a unit represents, without the social norms that make promises feel binding, no monetary system can function. The money is downstream from the agreement, not upstream from it. This is something that tends to get lost in the way we talk about money in everyday life. We treat money as if it were a natural feature of the world, like gravity or sunlight. Something that was always there, something that will always be there, something that doesn't require our ongoing cooperation to maintain. But it isn't. It never was. Money is a technology. A very old and very sophisticated social technology. But a technology nonetheless. It was invented, or rather it emerged, and it is maintained every single day by the ongoing cooperation of enormous numbers of people who agree to treat certain things as valuable and to honor certain obligations. If we step back a little further, we can think about what happens when that agreement breaks down, when the shared fiction stops working. And history gives us many examples to look at, gently and without any sense of alarm. Just as illustrations of how fragile and how durable money can be, depending on circumstances. Hyperinflation is one of the most dramatic illustrations of what happens when trust in a currency erodes. The classic modern example is Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. When the German mark collapsed so completely that people needed wheelbarrows full of bills to buy a loaf of bread. Or Zimbabwe in the late 2000s, when inflation reached truly astronomical levels and the government eventually printed $100 trillion notes. Or more recently, Venezuela, where the currency lost the vast majority of its value over a period of a few years. In each of these cases, the physical money still existed. The paper was still there, the denominations were printed on it, the government still declared it legal tender. But people stopped believing it would hold its value. They stopped trusting that the number on the bill would still be meaningful the next day, or the next hour. And as that trust eroded, the currency stopped functioning. People began to barter instead, or to trade in foreign currencies that they trusted more, or to use other stores of value like gold or food or tobacco or anything else that felt more stable. What hyperinflation reveals is the thing that's normally invisible. In normal times, we don't notice the agreement. We just use the money and it works, and we don't think about what's holding the whole system together. But in hyperinflation, the agreement collapses fast enough that you can watch it happen. You can see the moment when people stop treating the paper as money and start treating it as worthless paper. And the interesting thing is that the collapse isn't about the physical paper changing. The bills at the end of the Weimar hyperinflation were not materially different from the bills at the beginning. What changed was the belief. The collective confidence that the number on the bill meant something. That confidence drained away, and when it was gone, the money was gone, even though the paper remained. If we step back a little further from these modern examples of monetary crisis, we find that they're not unusual in the long sweep of history. Currencies have failed before. Empires have debased their coins, adding cheaper metals to reduce the gold or silver content while maintaining the nominal value, until people noticed and stopped accepting the coins at face value. Medieval kings clipped coins, shaving a small sliver off the edge of each gold coin that passed through royal hands, accumulating the clippings as a hidden tax, until the coins were too obviously underweight to pass. Credit systems have extended too far and then collapsed when borrowers couldn't repay. The history of money is not a story of smooth, steady progress. It's a story of invention and collapse and reinvention. Of systems that worked until they didn't, and were then replaced by new systems that worked until they didn't either. The dollar we use today is not the first attempt at money, not the 1000th attempt, but one in a very long series of experiments in the social technology of exchange. If we step back even further, before the modern nation-state and its central bank and its official currency, we find a much more fragmented monetary landscape. A world where many different things served as money in different places at the same time, and where the value of any given currency was not guaranteed by any central authority, but had to be established through use and reputation. In medieval Europe, for example, there was no single currency. There were hundreds of different coins issued by different rulers, different cities, different bishops, different trading organizations. When a merchant from one city wanted to trade with a merchant from another city, they had to figure out the exchange rates between their currencies. What was a Florentine florin worth in terms of Venetian ducats? What was a pound sterling worth compared to a French livre? These questions were not rhetorical. They required actual calculation, actual negotiation, actual expertise. There were people whose entire profession was knowing the answers to these questions. They sat at tables in market squares and cities and conducted exchanges between different currencies. The word bank, in fact, comes from the Italian word banca, meaning the bench or table at which these money changers sat. This world of multiple competing currencies sounds chaotic, but it was actually quite functional, most of the time. Currencies competed for trust. If a particular ruler debased their currency too aggressively, merchants simply stopped accepting it, or accepted it only at a heavy discount. Reputation mattered. A coin issued by a city known for honest monetary practices was worth more than a coin from a city known for debasing. The market, in a sense, policed monetary behavior by the simple mechanism of trust and refusal. And beneath all of this, running through medieval European commerce like a circulatory system, were the great merchant banking families and the international credit networks they maintained. The Medicis, the Fuggers, the various Hanseatic League members and Italian merchant houses. These were organizations that had developed sophisticated instruments for moving value across distances and across currency boundaries without actually moving gold. The Bill of Exchange, a document that committed a merchant or banker in one city to pay a specified amount to a specified party in another city, was one of the most important financial innovations of the medieval period. You could give your gold to a Medici agent in Florence, and receive a piece of paper that could be redeemed for its equivalent in gold at a Medici office in Venice or Bruges or London. The gold never moved. The paper moved. And this worked because the Medicis had a reputation for honoring their bills. This is, in some ways, very close to what modern banking does. The mechanism is different, the scale is vastly larger, the speed is incomparably faster. But the underlying logic is the same. Trusted intermediaries facilitate the movement of value through a network of promises, without the actual physical goods ever having to move. If we step back a little further, before these sophisticated medieval banking networks, we find older versions of similar mechanisms in the ancient world. The ancient Romans had a complex financial system with loans, interest, and various forms of credit. The ancient Greeks had banking institutions that made loans and accepted deposits. Ancient temples in Mesopotamia and Egypt functioned as financial centers. The basic human desire to lend and borrow, to extend present value into the future and repay it later, appears to be nearly as old as settled civilization. At an earlier stage, in the deep past of human prehistory, before writing and before cities, we have to rely on anthropology rather than archaeology. We can't look at records because there were no records. But we can look at the evidence that anthropologists have gathered from studying communities that continued to live without formal money systems into the modern era. And from that evidence, draw careful inferences about what pre-monetary economic life might have looked like. What emerges from this research is a picture of economic life organized primarily around kinship, reciprocity, and gift exchange. In small communities of people who all knew each other, the economy was embedded in social life in a way that makes it hard to separate the two. When you gave something to someone, you weren't making a purely transactional transfer. You were making a social gesture, maintaining a relationship, contributing to the community's collective well-being. And the expectation was not that you would receive exactly equivalent value back immediately, but that you were a member of a community that would take care of its members. This is the system that the anthropologist Marcel Mauss called the gift economy, based on his study of indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest and other regions. In a gift economy, giving is not altruism and it's not barter. It's something more complex. When you give, you create an obligation. The recipient is now, in some social sense, indebted to you. Not in a harsh or punitive way, but in a way that maintains the fabric of reciprocity that holds the community together. Gifts flow around a community, and the bonds they create are what holds people together. What's interesting about this system is that it already contains, in embryonic form, many of the elements that will eventually crystallize into money. It has credit, in the sense of obligations that persist over time. It has a kind of accounting, social and informal rather than written, but accounting nonetheless. It has a mechanism for distributing goods and labor through a community in a way that more or less balances out over time. It just doesn't have a unit. There's no standardized measure. The obligations are personal and qualitative rather than impersonal and quantitative. The emergence of money might be understood, in this light, as the process by which those personal obligations became impersonal, those qualitative debts became quantitative ones, those social bonds became contractual ones. A process that made exchange possible with strangers, across distances, without the personal relationship that used to be the foundation of every transaction. Money, in this view, is a way of encoding trust with people you've never met and may never meet. It's a technology for extending the web of reciprocity beyond the boundaries of what personal relationship can sustain. If we step back a little further still, before even these prehistoric economies, we find ourselves at the very beginning. Not of money specifically, but of the conditions that make money necessary or useful. We find ourselves thinking about why exchange exists at all. Why people trade with each other rather than each producing everything they need independently. The answer is specialization. Humans are remarkably good at getting better at things through practice and focus. If one person spends all their time making pottery and another spends all their time hunting, both of them will, over time, become much better at their respective activities than either of them would have been if they had tried to do both. The potter will make better pots. The hunter will catch more game. And if they trade, both of them will have better pots and more meat than they could have produced on their own. This is the basic logic of specialization and trade, and it applies at every scale from two people to the entire global economy. It's why cities form, why professions exist, why the modern world is so extraordinarily interconnected. Specialization makes everyone more productive, but it also makes everyone more dependent on everyone else, because you can only specialize if there's a system in place to distribute what you produce and deliver to you what others produce. Money is part of that system. It's the lubricant that keeps specialization and exchange running smoothly. Without some medium of exchange, the gains from specialization would be severely limited by the practical difficulties of barter. With a shared medium, those gains can be fully realized across enormous distances and between complete strangers. But specialization itself is older than money, and older than civilization. Even among hunter-gatherer groups that had no currency and no formal markets, there was a kind of specialization based on individual skills and temperaments. Some people were better at tracking animals. Some were better at identifying edible plants. Some were better at making tools. The community as a whole benefited from having members who were better at different things, and the social systems that distributed food and goods through the community were ways of rewarding and sustaining that specialization even before formal exchange systems existed. So in some sense, the story of money begins not with the invention of coins or the first clay tablets, but with the first moment a human decided to focus on becoming good at one thing, trusting that the community would provide the other things they needed. That moment of specialization is the moment that requires, eventually, some system of exchange. An exchange, scaled up and extended to strangers, requires money. If we step back even further, we arrive at something more abstract but still important. We arrive at the concept of value itself. Before there can be a system for representing and exchanging value, there has to be value to represent. And value is one of the most philosophically slippery concepts in all of human thought. What makes something valuable? This is a question that economists and philosophers have been arguing about for centuries, and there isn't a clean consensus answer. But there are a few useful ways of thinking about it. One way is the utility theory of value. Something is valuable because it's useful, because it does something that matters to the people who have it. Food is valuable because it keeps you alive. Shelter is valuable because it keeps you safe and warm. Tools are valuable because they make work easier. This theory has intuitive appeal, but it runs into trouble with things like gold, which is beautiful but not particularly useful for survival, and with the fact that people value things in wildly different amounts even when the utility seems similar. Another way is the labor theory of value, associated with classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and later Karl Marx. On this view, things are valuable because of the labor that went into creating them. A table is worth more than a pile of wood because someone spent time and effort turning the wood into the table. The value of the labor is, on this theory, transferred to the product. This theory also has intuitive appeal, but it runs into trouble with things like land, which has value but required no labor to create, and with the fact that labor can be applied to produce things that nobody wants. A third way is the subjective theory of value, which emerged in the late 19th century and is now the dominant view in mainstream economics. On this view, value is not a property of things at all. It's a relationship between things and people. Something is valuable because someone values it, because they want it, or need it, or prefer it. And how much they value it is a matter of their individual situation and preferences. The same glass of water is worth almost nothing to someone who just filled their canteen at a spring, and worth enormously much to someone dying of thirst in a desert. What's interesting about the subjective theory of value for our purposes is that it makes explicit something that was implicit in the other theories. Value is always, ultimately, about people. About what people want and need and prefer. It's a social fact, not a natural one. The world doesn't come pre-labeled with price tags. Humans create value by caring about things, and exchange systems are ways of coordinating all those individual carings into a coherent social order. If we step back a little further from value and think about scarcity, we find another foundational concept. Things are valuable, in large part, because they're not available in unlimited abundance. Air is extraordinarily useful for staying alive, but it has no price in a normal market because it's everywhere. If air became scarce, it would immediately become enormously valuable. Water is more valuable than air in economic terms because it's less universally available. Gold is more valuable than copper because it's rarer. And so on. Scarcity is what makes the coordination problem interesting. If everything was available in unlimited quantities, there would be no need to choose, no need to trade, no need to track who gets what. The whole system of money and exchange only matters because the good things in the world are limited, and there are more people who want them than there are things to go around. The fundamental purpose of any economic system, including the monetary system, is to address that coordination problem. To figure out how to distribute limited goods among many people with different needs and preferences. Money addresses that problem by creating a common language in which the relative scarcity of things can be expressed. When a thing is rare and in high demand, its price in money rises. When it's abundant and there's little demand for it, its price falls. The price is a signal that carries information through the system about where things are needed and where they're available. It's a compressed representation of the supply and demand situation for any given good, updated continuously by the actions of all the buyers and sellers in the market. This price signaling function of money is one of the things that makes it such a powerful and durable technology. It's not just a medium of exchange or a store of value. It's also an information system. A decentralized, continuously updated database of relative values. And that information system has, for a very long time, done an impressive job of coordinating the complex economic lives of millions or billions of people. At an earlier stage, if we follow this thread about information and coordination backward, we find that the problem of coordinating large numbers of people has always been the central challenge of civilization. How do you get thousands, then millions, then billions of people to work together in a way that produces outcomes that are generally good for the group? How do you ensure that the farmer grows food, the builder builds houses, the doctor learns to heal, and that all of these people are able to trade the products of their labor for the things they need from each other? Different civilizations have tried different solutions to this problem. Some have relied heavily on central command. A pharaoh or an emperor or a central planning committee decides what will be produced, how much, and how it will be distributed. Some have relied on religious and social obligation. The temple or the community defines what is owed and received. Some have relied on market mechanisms and the price signal. And most real systems throughout history have been some combination of all three. Money is primarily associated with the market approach, the distributed approach, the approach that says no one person or institution needs to oversee the whole system because the price signals will coordinate everyone's decisions. But money has also been used in command economies, as a unit of account even when the distribution of goods was centrally directed. And money interacts constantly with the social obligations and norms that predate it. The point is that money didn't emerge in a vacuum. It emerged as part of a long, slow, largely unplanned human project of figuring out how to live together in large groups without killing each other over resources. And it was useful for that project in specific ways that made it persist and spread. Wherever people wanted to trade across distances and with strangers, wherever communities grew large enough that personal obligation and gift exchange couldn't handle all the coordination needed, something like money tended to appear. If we step back a little further, we can sit for a moment with what would happen if we tried to take money away from a complex modern society. Not in any dramatic or alarming way. Just as a thought experiment. What would actually break? The first thing that would break is price signals. Without money, there's no way to know, in any clear and universal sense, whether a given good is abundant or scarce. You might be able to tell locally what's available and what isn't. But you couldn't coordinate production and distribution across large distances and between strangers. A farmer in one region might have too much wheat while a city 1,000 miles away is short. Without the price signal, there's no automatic mechanism to communicate that mismatch and direct resources to where they're needed. The second thing that would break is the ability to defer consumption. Money lets you save. You can do a day's work today and keep the value of that work, in the form of money, to spend next week or next year or in retirement. Without money, you'd have to consume immediately or find ways of preserving actual goods, which is much harder and more wasteful. The ability to store value over time is one of the most important services money provides, and without it, planning and investment become dramatically harder. The third thing that would break is the coordination of large-scale production. Building a factory, or a hospital, or a ship requires bringing together enormous amounts of labor and material from many different sources. Money is the medium through which all of those contributions are organized and compensated. Without it, you need some other mechanism to coordinate everyone involved, and it's hard to imagine one that would work as smoothly at scale. None of this means that a world without money is impossible. Humans managed to live for most of their history with only very primitive monetary systems, and some communities have operated outside money systems even in the modern era. But it means that the scale and complexity of modern life, with its global supply chains and specialized professions and interconnected systems, depends very heavily on the monetary infrastructure that makes it possible. Take away money and something would have to replace it, and whatever replaced it would quickly start to look a lot like money. If we step back even further, we can think about the future of money, moving now in the other direction. Not backward into history but forward into possibilities. And here the landscape becomes interesting in a different way. We started this journey with the person tapping their phone at a coffee shop. Money at its most invisible and abstract, most purely informational, most completely severed from any physical anchor. And we've traveled backward through bank accounts and credit cards and paper money and gold-backed currencies and commodity currencies and barter and gift exchange and the deep roots of economic cooperation in prehistoric human life. We've peeled back layer after layer of the money system and found, at the core, something very simple: a shared agreement. A collective decision to treat something as representing value and to honor the obligations that represent creates. The future of money seems likely to continue in the direction of abstraction. Cryptocurrencies and blockchain systems are attempting to create monetary systems that are governed by code rather than by human institutions. Systems where the agreement is enforced not by the trust we place in governments or banks, but by mathematics. Where the rules of the system are transparent and immutable, and don't depend on any individual or organization to enforce them. Whether these systems will succeed in the ways their creators hope is genuinely uncertain. The history of monetary innovation is full of experiments that solved some problems and created others, that worked under some conditions and failed under others. Cryptocurrencies have shown genuine promise and genuine limitations, and it's not clear yet which aspects of them will persist and which will be replaced or refined. But the thing that's clear is that whatever form money takes in the future, it will still be a form of social agreement. It will still require that many people agree to treat something as representing value and to honor that representation in their dealings with each other. The technology can change, the medium can change, the institution enforcing the agreement can change. But the agreement itself, the collective faith in the system, is what makes money work. And that faith is something that no technology can create by itself. This is one of the deepest truths about money. It is ultimately held together by human trust, not in any mystical or fragile sense. The trust is very robust when conditions are right, and it has sustained complex monetary systems for thousands of years. But it is human trust nonetheless. It's the accumulated confidence of billions of people, acting in their daily lives, treating numbers on screens and pieces of paper and metal discs as meaningful, treating the system as reliable. Extending that small act of faith every time they hand over a bill or accept a payment or check their bank balance. If we step back a little further from the future and return to the present, there's something worth noticing about how we relate to money in our everyday lives. For most people, money is invisible in the same way that water is invisible to fish. It's the medium everything moves through. It's the background against which all economic activity takes place. You don't think about what money is when you're buying groceries or paying rent or checking your paycheck. You just use it. It works. You move on. But occasionally, in moments of crisis or confusion, the machinery becomes visible for a moment. When a currency collapses, when a bank fails, when there's a financial panic and suddenly the whole system seems to be shaking. In those moments, people get a glimpse of the actual foundation of the thing. They see that it's held together by confidence, and that confidence can, under sufficiently extreme conditions, drain away. And that glimpse is often frightening. But it's also illuminating. Because once you've seen that money is a social technology rather than a natural fact, you understand something important. You understand that it's something humans made, and that means humans can change it, can redesign it, can build better versions, can address its flaws, can experiment with alternatives. The history of monetary innovation is not finished. It never will be finished. As long as humans are doing complex things together and need to coordinate, they will be experimenting with the tools of coordination, including money. If we step back one more time, very gently, to the very beginning of what we've been thinking about tonight, there's a small, simple observation worth resting with. The person tapping their phone at the coffee shop, in that tiny fraction of a second, is participating in something that stretches back through the entire length of human civilization. The invisible signals that travel between the phone and the card reader and the bank servers are the most recent expression of something that goes all the way back to the first time two people made a promise to each other and trusted that the promise would be honored. The medium has changed almost beyond recognition. The clay tablet and the smartphone are not obviously related. The cowrie shell and the blockchain have very little in common on the surface. But underneath, threading through all of it, is the same basic human thing. The desire to live together and to help each other, the recognition that none of us can produce everything we need on our own, and the willingness to extend trust a little further than we can see. To believe that someone we've never met will honor an obligation, because the system says they will. Because everyone agrees they should, because the money makes it so. And that willingness, that basic act of faith in each other's word and in the shared system we've built together, is what money has always been. What it is right now. What it will be in whatever form comes next. There's something quietly reassuring about that, actually. The system is not magic and it's not infallible. But it's also not arbitrary. It's built on something real. On the genuine usefulness of cooperation, on the genuine human need for coordination, on the genuine and recurring discovery, in culture after culture across all of history, that things go better when people work together and find ways to make exchange possible. The money in your pocket, or in the number on your screen that represents what's in your bank account, is the current expression of all of that. A very long, very human, very ongoing project of figuring out how to live together well. And on that gentle note, it feels like a good place to let things settle. We've traveled a long way tonight, from the tap of a phone to the very roots of why humans exchange it all, and back again. The layers of money are many, and each one rests on the ones beneath it, all the way down to that oldest and simplest foundation. A willingness to trust, to believe that the agreement will hold, that tomorrow someone will still honor what today means. You don't have to hold on to any of this. Let it drift. Let the ideas go where they want to go in your mind, or let them dissolve entirely. The point was never to master anything, just to look slowly at something familiar until it became, for a moment, a little strange, a little interesting, a little wider than it usually seems. And then to let it be ordinary again, comfortably ordinary, the way money is when you're not thinking about it. Rest well. Everything can wait until morning.